Hey everyone, back with the Talisman series here. So, last time we covered the Cataclysm. If you hadn't seen that video yet already, I have a whole bunch of different expansions that I cover as far as the basic rules and concept. And as you can see, I currently don't have the base game board in front of me as I'm in the middle of a game with my family. So, I want to start getting more towards the characters and break it up by expansions with each certain level of difficulty, strategy, and as far as experiences go. So with the base game characters, it's all going to really depend because I could do this in either a 2 or a 3-part video as we've got 14 characters to cover. So as you can see here, I've got the priest in front of me. Now, the priest, if you can see his stats very well, has a fate value of 5, which is pretty solid. In fact, he has one of the highest fate counts of all characters in Talisman. But he's only got like a strength of 2 and a craft of 4. So he's going to be more of your craft type of character and that sort of thing. You can see starting position towards the bottom here. He starts in the chapel. Now the chapel doesn't necessarily provide any immediate benefits as far as when the game begins. And I'll start going into terms as far as what the early game looks like when you've just started and you got your base stats and everything that you need. And then start progressing towards the middle of the game when you're starting to collect certain objects and your stats are a little bit higher, close towards the end game. So with the priest, he begins the game with a spell. He is one of many characters who starts with a spell. So as far as uniqueness of ability, it's not necessarily all the best. But starting the game with a spell can be good in the grand scheme of things when you have all the other expansions. And you can find out what it is your spell is and then use it in all sorts of ways. So for his first ability, you can see here, after rolling the die when praying, you must add 1 to the score. Or you may. So, overall, big picture wise, in the base game board, you'll be able to pray at the chapel or at the temple over here. Both of these places aren't necessarily the highest of benefits, but they're definitely areas that you want to take advantage of. So for the priest's fourth ability, it's a little bit longer than that. You may choose to automatically destroy any spirits without resorting to psychic combat. When you destroy a spirit in this manner, you may not keep the enemy as a trophy, but you may gain 1 spell. That character ability basically reads as such: whenever enemies, such as like the Wraith, pops up, you don't have to fight in direct psychic combat with the craft of 4 that the priest has with any modifiers, and then do the whole rolling process and hope that your score is high enough. You can just, if you choose, automatically destroy it and then get a spell from it, which honestly is a pretty solid ability, especially as you start going through spells, because with the craft of 4 that the priest has, you can already carry at least 1 spell at a time. So if you're going through spirits at a very quick pace, you can start cycling spells, and generally characters who cycle spells do very, very well. Especially since the early game, the whole goal is for you to be drawing as many cards as you possibly can. The only real downside with the priest, though, is that last ability, is where you may not use any weapons during battle. Which, as far as the character goes, it makes sense. He's a good character, he's a man of the church, that sort of thing. But weapons like the flail from the city expansion, or anything like that, that has very powerful boosts to strength, you gotta consider that you can't carry those with the priest. So overall, Priest is, I'd say, a pretty decent character. He's not the best one to pick, but he's not one that you can't work around. If you're able to kill a lot of spirits and cycle through spells through that way, generally, like I mentioned earlier, spellcasters are going to be more dangerous. So now, I'll start getting into as far as how you play against the priest. Because the priest doesn't have any ability to attack with craft, you could go that way, but just note that he has a higher craft value and is able to gain craft a lot quicker than, say, strength. So any strength-based characters, like the assassin maybe, or something, or anyone who really specializes in strength, the priest is very vulnerable to. And also, because he's a good character, areas like the graveyard, or any items that are specified for alignment, especially when you start getting into the Sacred Pool expansion, the priest can't really get a hold of. But overall, when you start thinking in the big picture, when you start pulling in the four corners, if you choose the Cataclysm board, priest doesn't really have much to offer, so it's not very easy to gauge him very highly on the grand scheme of things when it comes to selecting characters. He's a character that you might want, but I'd consider him a bit on the lower side, especially when we start getting into these other expansions. So aside from the priest, we've also got the Ghoul that I have here. Now, the Ghoul is an interesting character because he's the first evil character that I'm covering in this batch. So he's evil. He starts in the graveyard, which makes sense from a thematic standpoint. He's a ghoul. He's a ghost long dead. So he starts at the graveyard there. So what makes him interesting for his stats is that he's already pretty similar to the priest. He has a strength of 2 and a craft of 4. He has a fate of 4, which is pretty solid if you ask me. But then when we start getting to his character abilities in the way that he builds, it's a little bit interesting. So the first point, when you attack another character, you may choose to make the attack psychic combat. You may not do this when you are attacked by another character. So by that point alone, we can already see that the Ghoul is a bit more on the offensive side of things in comparison to the priest. When your craft is high, you can attack other players with craft. But just note that any other characters who have craft can also attack you that certain way. Meaning that if there's any other characters that also can do psychic combat and they attack you, you can't do the same thing. So you want to watch how aggressive you are and who it is you're really trying to go against. With the second character ability, we can see whenever you defeat a character in psychic combat, if you choose to take one of his lives, add it to your own. So regularly in the base game, there is an item that's called the Rune Sword, which is generally used for evil characters, which does the same thing for strength. But being able to leech life off of other characters with your craft being high enough is definitely a very good way of staying alive, especially when we start getting into the harder expansions like the Firelands or the Harbinger, or perhaps even the Dragon. It becomes important that you want your characters to be sustainable. So being able to produce that high craft and being able to take lives from other characters and give them to yourself is definitely something that you want to try to play with when you're playing with Ghoul. Now, this third ability is where things start to get interesting, and he kind of starts to differentiate himself. When you kill an enemy in battle, you may raise it from the dead and keep it as a follower instead of a trophy. You may have one of your raised followers add its strength to yours for one battle, after which it disintegrates to the discard pile. You may only use one raised follower per battle. So, Ray's followers, I personally have not had enough experiences with the Ghoul to find his Ray's follower ability to be very useful. When it comes to the base game, generally the strongest things that you're going to face is either a Craft 10 Demon or a Strength 7 Dragon, which isn't bad, but seeing as how the stats already are a Strength of 2 and a Craft of 4, and you've got to do so much work to build up and find all the spirits and that sort of things in order to boost your craft in order to be suitable. I haven't found his Raising the Dead ability to be very useful, especially since it's only one trophy at a time and it can only be used for one battle. And remember, battle is a term in which it involves strength, it doesn't involve craft. The Ghoul isn't very good with strength at all. So he's also another character in which, if you have a very offensive opponent, someone who is very aggressive, who likes to attack other players more, someone who likes to develop their strength more, the Ghoul isn't really going to stand much of a chance. When you start thinking of it from the bigger picture sort of things, the Ghoul doesn't really stand a chance against anything. Like, inside the dungeon, most enemies average about a strength of 4 or higher alone. So there's nothing really useful there. In the Highlands, it's all circumstantial. I mean, there's treasures that are pretty good for the Ghoul, but there's not enough strong or credible enemies to where those raised followers really do anything for you. To where adding the 2 to 4 strength or something like that would be very useful. So being able to raise enemies from the dead hasn't been something that I found very useful whenever I play the Ghoul. So overall, when you're thinking of it from the big picture, the Ghoul still kind of sits on the very low tier of characters. As far as he doesn't have much range to him, he's very limited in what he can do, and I feel that he becomes more limited as you get into the other expansions. So would I put him above the Priest per se, as far as scaling him and what kind of strategies you want to run with him? Not really. The Priest's abilities to gain spells for every spirit that he kills already puts him at an advantage, because there are spells that can take away craft or spells that can add strength. To which, basically, if a priest is cycling through enough spells, especially in early game, and when you start getting towards the middle of the game, when things are starting to flesh out, the priest already can climb ahead of the Ghoul. It's very, very difficult for the Ghoul to really start to gain some traction and build himself enough to where all these raised followers start to become useful to you. So now with the Dwarf is definitely an interesting character. I'd say that overall, he is leagues better than the Ghoul and the Priest, even if you combined their character abilities. So as you can see here, the Dwarf is our first neutral character, and he starts in the Crags. He has a strength of 3 and a craft of 3. So he's a bit more on the balanced side as far as base stats go. And he also has a fate value of 5, which is really good. In fact, I do believe that the Priest and the Dwarf have the highest fate value in the entire game. So having a lot of fate can definitely be useful. So, as you can see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 abilities that the Dwarf has. So the first one being, you need not roll the die in the crags for the chasm, unless you wish to. If you choose to roll, you may accept the result. That in itself is pretty solid, although it's not very common that you'll travel into the chasm, or really through the crags, when you start playing the game. Generally in the base game, you'll run into it every now and then, but being able to pass through both of those without any problems whatsoever, unless you really chose to, is definitely something that I could see being very beneficial, with the crags especially. If you're looking to boost your stats inside the crags, maybe you want to get some more strength, then you can definitely take your chances as you see fit, and you're not obligated to roll the die in the crags, which is definitely useful. Next character ability that the dwarf has is you may evade creatures and characters in the hills. So the hills is a very limited area as far as the base game board goes, especially even the Cataclysm board. So those spaces you're not going to really run into, but when you start getting to places like the Highlands, it starts to become useful. Because the Highlands, like I mentioned in that video, has a bit more challenging enemies, so being able to evade certain things is definitely very useful. Just makes the trek up the Highlands a lot easier. The next one, after rolling one die in the cave, you may add one to the score. There is a place inside of the base game that is the cave, which allows you to roll and can do things like get you up to 3 gold if you roll a 6. So being able to add one to those stats is very useful, because it not only comes up in the base game, but other expansions also carry it too. So being able to have that extra boost and that greater chance of getting 3 gold is definitely something that you want to pull ahead on, especially if your strategy is more focused on getting the riches from the Highlands and then moving from the Highlands to the city, like I like to do. But then here is where the dwarf really starts to shine. So you need only roll 2 dice in the mines, or roll 1 die when you're in the portal of power by craft. So generally the dwarf is a bit more on the balance side as far as stats go. So having a strength of 3 and a craft of 3. With his character abilities, it suggests that you want to also go the craft route, much like the Ghoul and the Priest. So it's not necessarily bad. Honestly, I'd say that being able to only need to roll 1 die to get inside the portal of power is very useful, instead of the 2 die, because it greatly increases the chances that you'll roll less than whatever your strength or craft value is. So you'll definitely, when it comes to the dwarf, you want to go on the craft side of things, because it just makes things a lot easier. Again, when you're in the middle region, when you're passing through the mines, and generally you would have to roll 3 dice. But being able to take 1 away allows you to increase the chances of subtracting the 0 and staying where you are, or maybe even being less than that. And then the last thing is that the dwarf is unaffected by the maze, so there's a card in the adventure deck that's known as the maze, to where essentially, if your craft is less than 5, you would lose a turn when you landed there, but because the dwarf can just pass freely, it makes it a lot easier to get past those obstructions. So overall, especially with the portal power by craft, only needing to roll 1 die, and then the 2 dice in the maze, the mines, it really starts to become beneficial with the dwarf if you're able to accelerate through the early and middle game very quickly. If you can build your stats high enough where you can get a lot of craft, that sort of thing. There's not a lot of early game benefits, but the dwarf is more of an end game type of character, where now we're starting to make the run towards the crown of command, and we have all of our objects, different followers, and that sort of thing. So his strategy when you're playing him is to definitely go the craft route and to take advantage of the various areas that you can take advantage of, because it makes sense. If you're the dwarf, dwarf's a short guy. He's going to be able to crawl through the crags very quickly and the chasm very quickly. He's going to be able to just avoid the maze because he's very small. He's worked the caves, so it makes sense that he would know his right way around. As far as playing against the dwarf, you want to take advantage of his small stats. Pretty much with any character, you want to take advantage of their stats in the early game. There are just some characters in other expansions and in this base game to where if you start pressing aggressively against the dwarf and you start attacking him quite frequently, there's not much that he can really do to defend himself. When we start getting into the other expansions, there's not really anything that he can control. So Again, he's still limited, but he's got a lot more wiggle room towards the end game that you want to keep in mind if the dwarf is the character that you want to pick. Quick disclaimer with this next character. I'm gonna just straight up tell you, straight out the gate, that the monk is a character that you do not want to play at all. With a strength of 2 and a craft of 3, he still doesn't really offer anything that makes him really good. Sure, he has a fate of 5, much like the dwarf and the priest, so that's pretty good. But other than that, he really doesn't have anything to offer. He starts with the village, but again, that doesn't really provide any strategical advantages for him. So this first ability, your inner belief, allows you to add your craft value to your strength during battle. A lot of videos get this wrong. So people assume that the craft value is whatever your craft is. So if you built your strength to a craft of 6, you could combine that 6 craft with your strength. No, that is not the case. Craft value, as specified in the rules, is what is printed here on the card. So this craft of 3 is added to this strength of 2. Which, quite honestly, just makes him super weak. Like, there's literally nothing that you can do with your inner belief to where the monk really starts to become useful. Because his stats just aren't high enough. If he had a craft of 5, or if we pushed it up to a craft of 6, then maybe he could start to become a bit more of a credible character. But the monk is just absolutely useless. There's really nothing that you can do with him. He prays like the priest, but the priest at least can gain spells on killing things. Monk doesn't. He can just add 1 to the score whenever he prays. And then, as you will eventually find out with characters like the Knight, when I cover the Reaper characters who can do 2 to the score instead of 1, it just makes the monk completely null and void. And the thing that sucks about him the most is that he can't use weapons or armor during battle at all. I get it, it's monk principle, and as far as sticking to the character, it works, but overall, what can you really do with him? In fact, he is easily the saddest character that you can face. Any of these other characters, I'd honestly say, are way better than the monk. There's really nothing else to say. If you end up getting stuck with the monk, if he just somehow comes up in a respawn period or something like that, get rid of him. Try to kill him off as quickly as possible. You really aren't going to do anything with him. So what's the point in keeping him around? Fate might be nice, but only that will get you so far. Especially when you have the Reaper and the Werewolf, and at times the Harbinger out, which all have a roll chart that may or may not require to use Fate, and you'll use all that up. So what's the point in using the Monk? So even from a big scale picture to a small scale picture, just stay away from him. There's literally no point in being the monk. Okay, so with the elf isn't a bad character, but overall I feel he's only maybe 1 step above the monk as far as what he can do. So he also is a good character, and he starts in the forest. So the forest isn't necessarily a bad starting location, as it puts you closer to the woodlands if that's something that you're trying to do very early. It's entirely up to you. But with the way that his character is built, he doesn't really offer a lot of options as far as what you can do. It's not as open end to where you can apply it to certain things. It's all very specific. So as you can see with his stats here, he has a strength of 3, a craft of 4, also a fate of 3, which tends to be more on the normal end of things when it comes to characters. So his first ability, you need not roll the die in the forest unless you wish to. If you choose to roll, you must accept the result. So it basically implies that with the forest in the base game, it's all towards craft, and if you roll a 6, you'll have someone help you gain craft. But you don't really need it if you're the elf. Like, you might be able to push your luck and try to gain craft in the forest, but with it being a 1 out of 6 chance, what are the real likelihoods that that's something that's going to be beneficial to you? Not really high, I'd say. So, this next ability, you may evade creatures and characters in the woods. Not necessarily bad. Again, it's not the best ability in the world. In fact, I can't even say it's the worst ability in the world. It's just that in the base game, it's so limited because there's only so many wood spaces. One in the inner region, one in the middle region, and maybe two in the outer region. Even if you count the wood spaces in the woodlands, that doesn't really do much. It might be temporary breaks, but when you start getting into things like the Firelands and the Harbinger, where spaces start to shift and change, those spaces could already be gone in an instant. So basically, he has nothing to protect himself from. And it is the same with his last ability. Here. If you are on the woods, instead of rolling the die for your move, you may move to any other woods in the same region. Again, that's not really good. If it was an actual teleport, per se, if it was from the woods in any region, that would make it a lot better, because then you could teleport from the woods in the outer region to the middle region, or you could go from the middle region to the outer region, or you could go from the outer region to the woodlands wood spaces, which would be a lot more beneficial, I'd say. But because it's all same region, you're very limited in what you can do. Playing against the elf is super easy. He only has a strength of 3, and he has very restricted mobility, so aside from moving like a normal character, he can't really fight very well against a lot of things. Even in an early game, he really just gets off on luck. So overall, I want to say that the elf is only a tier above the monk, but he is nowhere near what the priest or the ghoul can be, is for trying to rank it all together. Okay, so in this batch of characters, this is where things actually can start to become useful. So with the Sorceress, as you can see, we have a strength of 2 and a craft of 4. Again, a lot of these spell-based characters are generally gonna be more focused on the craft side. A lot of the characters in this specific half are going to be focused on the craft side of things. So you want to be taking on as many spirits as you possibly can in order to gain more craft. So she is also an evil character and starts in the graveyard, which makes sense because dark magic, voodoo, and whatnot. Also, like the priests, she starts with a spell. I mean, it makes sense. She's a sorceress. She's going to have a spell. She knows some magic, some kind. Second character ability, when you attack another character, you may choose to make the attack psychic combat. You not do this when you are attacked by another character. So in this batch alone, we can see that we've got the Ghoul, who can attack with psychic combat, and the Sorceress, who can attack with psychic combat. For characters like the Elf, it does a lot of damage. It leaves a whole lot of vulnerability on that part. Being able to attack with psychic combat against characters who specialize in strength and not so much in craft is very beneficial. So it might prove fruitful for you in the early game to play a little bit more on the aggressive side with the Sorceress. Really take advantage of that psychic combat. Being able to have a craft of 4 and being able to attack other players who might have 3 craft or less, all things considered. Fate value of 3 is not necessarily a bad thing. It's more alongside the average. This next character ability, you may attempt to beguile a character that you land on, allowing you to take 1 gold or object of your choice. To do so, roll 1 die. You may roll a die to beguile a good character. You may roll a 6. You must roll a 6 to beguile a good character, 5 or 6 for a neutral character, or 4, 5, or 6 for evil characters. So all of that starts to become important, and essentially it's like the thief, but it's more of a 1 in 6 chance that you're going to be able to steal certain objects and that sort of thing. So Beguiling a character more works along the lines of if you choose not to attack the character or if you choose not to encounter what's on the space. So, as you could probably overhear from when I was reading the card, it's way easier to go after other evil characters and be able to beguile and take stuff from them than it is, say, a good character or a neutral character, which has maybe a third or maybe even a sixth of a chance of it actually succeeding. So beguiling is all situational. If there's certain objects, also consider that in the big picture of things, there is Dark Fate if the Woodlands is active. So characters are more than likely going to re-roll whatever you beguile if you're even successful enough to beguile a character. So you want to keep in mind watching what other characters have as far as fate goes, and kind of make it all situational and that sort of thing, and find ways to create opportunities, whether it be through your spells, to be able to make your beguile a lot more successful. Me personally, I haven't found a lot of success with the Sorceress, whether it be the base game, but especially when the expansions start to come into play. Now, this last character ability, you may take any follower except the maiden, unicorn, or princess from a character that you land on. Overall, that character ability isn't bad. Honestly, I'd say that being able to take followers super easily, except for those three, is pretty good. Because especially in this cataclysm here, there are events to where a whole bunch of followers from the discard pile will start to come back. And then you can, as you land on it, you can start taking them. And then as other people start taking followers, you can land on them and take their followers and sort of amass a entourage of followers. But when you start getting into characters like the Gladiator or even the Magus, characters who specifically are oriented to where having a huge amount of followers essentially makes or breaks the character, the Sorceress is a little bit more lenient as far as that goes, to where she's not dependent on followers, but she's not significantly helped by them either, if that makes any sense. So, as far as playing against the Sorceress, definitely don't want to leave her too open, as she can attack you psychically if she's pressing aggressively. And of course, with her more entirely focusing on the craft and the spells and that sort of thing, she is prone to strength-based characters. So any strength-based characters you might want to send after her. And when it comes to followers, it's not really useful until you get towards the end game, when you're trying to pass through the inner region, and then there's followers that might help you with basically being vampire bait inside of the vampire tower, where you have to sacrifice followers for your role. So being able to take those followers and being able to discard whichever ones are least useful to you is pretty useful. But overall, I'd still keep the Sorceress on the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to how good of a character she is. Lastly, we've got a character that is entirely focused on strength. As you can see here, the troll has a strength of 6, which is the strongest base strength in the entire game, but a measly craft of 1, also with a fate of 1, but also has a life value of 6. So overall, the troll is another neutral character who starts in the crags here. Makes sense, he's a troll. He kind of lives around the mountains a little bit. So, with how obvious and drastic his stats are, obviously strength is the way to go. But with characters like the Sorceress and the Ghoul, you want to be careful and try to avoid them, because if they try to come after you and they attack you with psychic combat, there's not really anything that you can do with your craft of 1. So this first character ability is you need not roll the die in the crags unless you wish to. If you choose to roll, you must accept the results. Very much so like the elf with a forest, or the dwarf who also shares the same space as the troll. So he can pass through the crags freely. It might be useful to him as far as building up strength, because obviously with a strength of already 6 alone, you definitely want to be going the strength route with the troll. But just be aware that areas like the dungeon, which has a lot of spirits, may not be the best place for you to go. So you definitely want to build up strength and find ways to accommodate towards protecting yourself with craft. Because you're really not going to focus on spells, things like the amulet to protect you from the spellcasters, like the priest or the sorceress, when we get to the next part of the video, when we do the wizard, you'll definitely want some protection as the troll, because psychically you really can't do anything. Otherwise, I'd put the troll definitely on the higher end of the tier list, because he is so high in strength, to where if you build up enough strength, you can kill most enemies very early game. A lot of the enemies will fall to you, and if you start gaining weapons, whether it be from the village, especially when the other expansions start to come into play, and you really start to get strong, or when you find items to where you want to entirely focus on strength. For example, there are items in the dragon expansion to where it will turn your craft to strength. It's definitely something that you want to get your hands a hold of, because if you can entirely focus on strength, there's not really any characters that are going to stop you as the troll, unless you have the occasional spellcasters, which, like I said earlier, if you have an amulet that can protect you from spells, and you stay on the offensive with being able to attack with strength, then you'll be in a lot better of a position. Also, furthermore, I almost forgot to show the troll card, is that whenever you roll a 6 for your move, instead of moving, you may regenerate. If you choose to regenerate, heal 1 life, and your turn immediately ends. So being able to heal off of rolling a 6 is definitely something that you want to take advantage of too. Even though, statistically, it's a 1 in 6 chance, if you want to press your luck, you can do that. But it's definitely something where sustainability towards things like the Harbinger, or the Firelands, the Dragon expansions, or even the Cataclysm at times, being able to roll those 6s and being able to heal up and having that 6 health, which is also the highest amount of health that any base character, what character in Talisman in general has, it's definitely something that you want to strategize for. I will say that overall, this first batch of groups, easily, the top 2 characters are the priest and the troll. So if you have to ever choose between any of those characters, or if you're just looking and you're trying to decide what strategies might work the best for you, I'd recommend the troll and the priest. As the priest will allow you to kill spirits and get spells, and you can start cycling through spells through more spirits that you find. It especially becomes easier as other expansions start coming into play. And being able to stay on the outer region with the troll through the base game, and then eventually make your way towards other stuff, as strength being your entire motif, is definitely the best strategies that I recommend with this whole first bunch. So overall, this is the first half of the base game Talisman characters. In the next part, I will cover the other 7, and then from there, I'm going to find out whether I want to go in the same expansion order that I did the tutorial videos on, or if I want to go based entirely on difficulty, as far as how in-depth the characters are and how situational or environmental, or whether it's a personal thing, like especially with the woodland characters that I want to get into. But overall, I hope you guys found this video very informative as far as choosing which character. Again, not saying that any one character is the worst. Me personally, I find the monk to be the worst, but it's not entirely impossible to win with the monk. It's just that it's going to be more difficult and being able to identify the weaknesses and strengths of each of the characters, and being able to know that as you go into the game and you're in different phases from the early game to the mid game, especially towards the end game, you really start to find ways to pick apart the areas that you know you have control in, because about a portion of Talisman is being able to control what you can control. But things like knowing what spells are and adventure cards are obviously going to change how well things swing for you or whether it swings against your favor. So being able to control about that 40% of strategy that's in this game is definitely something that can help make the game easier.